As I was saying, beginning of chapter 3, we are now in here in our series on the book of Deuteronomy. As I explained to you all last week, the end of chapter 2, which we covered last week, and this week now here, the beginning of chapter 3, serve as two sides of the same proverbial coin, namely the conquest of the two Amorite kingdoms, that of Sihon and that of Og. Og, as in Ogre, is how it's pronounced for anyone who happens to be wondering. King Og, ruler of the land that we know as Bashan, and we'll explain all of what that means. But here this morning we're covering these opening 11 verses that finish off Moses recounting to the Israelites of the renowned and rather spectacular conquest of the Amorite kingdoms east of the Jordan River. There are a number of fascinating details that we're going to draw out here, some important historical connections that I suspect may be revelatory to some of you, which is usually a good thing because that means we're learning something. And it will open up for us one of the biggest points, not just of this specific text, but of these two kind of continuous portions of the end of chapter 2 and this opening of chapter 3, and the great significance ultimately of the conquest of the Amorite kingdoms. So let's begin in verse 1 of chapter 3. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, with all his people, came out to meet us in battle at Edrei. But Yahweh said to me, "Do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land over into your hand. And you shall do to him just as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon." Now, there are a number of things that are going on here that are establishing for us some of the fundamental principles that come out of this morning's text. But I want you to notice first off the bat, one of the significant differences between what we saw last week with the conquest of Sihon and here now this week with the conquest of Og. You may recall that one of the more important points exegetically was that indeed as the Israelites crossed out of the territory of Ammon, the Ammonites, into the borderlands of King Sihon and of his territories and realm, there was what made? A peace offering. Okay? We will move through your land dismounted on foot. That is the implication. So we will not ride in on war horses. We will march in and move through on foot. Okay? We will do trade with you. We're not going to rob you nor steal from you, but rather we will actually pay you for food, for water, for resources, etc., if you allow us to move through and pass your territory safely. And the response is a resounding no. The response is a resounding preemptive strike on the part of King Sihon, who actually launches out and attacks the Israelites. But we explained this motif and this pattern, which in the broader sense of the Pentateuch thus far, the Torah, the first 5 books, is something that has been very much a feature. Of course, most famously with that of Moses himself dealing with the Pharaoh of Egypt. Let my people go, no consequences. Okay? And a continuous repetition of this from Moses every single time, and again subsequently every time rejected, but after the 10th and final plague that God descends upon the Egyptians, now he has a temporary change of heart, does the Pharaoh. Okay, before then, of course, flipping that on its head and paying again the final great consequences of that in the destruction the Egyptian army faced at the Red Sea. But nonetheless, this pattern of peace offering, of God extending mercy, grace, and compassion undeserved to the enemies of God, is what we saw last week. But what you notice here is that as Moses is recounting the story, they have turned, they have head north into the kingdom of Og, and then immediately Og comes forth, and indeed with all his people, into battle. There isn't even the opportunity for an extension of peace nor compassion because of the hardness of Og's heart. We saw that concept playing out last week with Sihon, where God hardens his heart as a result. And we've explained in times past, and we explained last week, that this is not just in isolation, as if Sihon himself really wanted to do the right thing, but God sort of did some hocus pocus and then changed the whole scenario. No, it's a hardening of the heart within oneself that God then puts forth in his sovereignty and allows, and then further hardens in this kind of never-ending downward spiral. Okay, this is exactly what the Pharaoh of Egypt underwent as well. Here, the heart of Og is very much hard. It doesn't state that here, but the natural implication of the text, given what we saw at the end of chapter 2, is very much along those lines. There isn't even the opportunity for an extension of a peace treaty, so it were. There is the immediate armament and attack on the part of Og. No discussion, no debate, no diplomacy, so it were. There is merely the violence and the tyranny and the assaulting on the part of Og. This again builds our foundational understanding of who these people were and the overarching meta-narrative of why justice was being indeed brought against the Amorites that we went into in heavy detail last week. That these were not poor innocent natives holding hands, picking sunflowers, singing kumbaya and braiding each other's hair. As we explained last week, the Amorites were a renowned people in the ancient Near Eastern world, spread all across Mesopotamia, everywhere from here in and around the Jordan River. These are the Western Amorites, all the way north into what would be the land of Assyria and down to the east of Babylon. Those are all Amorite peoples. They are Babylonians in the broadest sense. Their culture, ruthless. Their customs, horrid. Their practices, evil. We've even found so many of these kinds of sites, archaeologically and historically, in the land of the Amorites and in the land of the Canaanites more broadly, that then of course Joshua and the new generation cross over and begin the conquest of Canaan. We've found these various sites all over the land. We have found them in various places that have all the remnants of everything that I've explained, especially last week, particularly the cultic institution of child sacrifice, okay, and the ritual nature of that. You can go to places like Gezer, for example, in the Judean mountains as they're called, east of Jerusalem, in and around that place, and then you have there famous temple structures and steles and religious high places that still have to this day the remains of sacrificed children, of children who we can clearly tell were buried in limestone pits, in jars that bear all the signs of having been beheaded, having been undergone what's called a hemicorporectomy. In other words, they were sawn in half. They remain charred in their bones, right? All the practices that are warned against in particularly Exodus and Leviticus. Do not sacrifice your children. Do not burn them. All those various things were not just God coming up with a nice ethical code. It was in fact an explicit and express command against the worshipful practices of the pagan nations. This is not speculative. We know this for a fact. Okay? This was standard and was done in the deepest religious sense. Okay? Part of what we explained last week is that one of the deepest and most profound evils of child sacrifice is not just merely the killing of children, not just merely killing of infants and of babies in the proper sense. I mentioned Gezer. We have evidence in Gezer of a corpse that is, in this case, remains, bones, that is clearly about 1 week old. Okay? Newborn in the truest possible sense. Sacrificed to Moloch. Why does this occur in Amorite and Canaanite culture, in ancient pagan culture? Well, for a variety of reasons, but the deepest sense is it is the people, the adults, sacrificing the future for immediate and present benefit, for wealth, for power, for resources, etc., etc., etc. It's a sacrificing of the future for present temporal gain. Okay? That's why, as I've said plenty of times from this pulpit, and as have many many clergymen like myself and others who have said and talked on the issue of abortion. It is child sacrifice in the truest definitional religious sense. It is the express sacrificing of the future for present temporal gain. Does that make sense? Okay. We know for a fact, overwhelmingly, survey after survey, study after study, that to almost the 99th percentile with regards to reasonings, self-given reasonings, on the part of women and or partners who have gone and gotten an abortion is for the express purpose of convenience. I'm not ready. I have a job. I can't miss my promotion. I'm climbing the corporate ladder. I am not ready to take care of a child because I'm in college, right, university, and I'm too busy studying, partying, doing everything else other than being responsible. It is a sacrificing of the future for present temporal gain. That is the metaphysical evil of child sacrifice. And that is why abortion expressly fits that very definition. It is religious child sacrifice, by definition. This was common practice. And again, that's before you talk about the various other elements of ancient Amorite culture, from the constant warfare, the constant carnage, the constant raiding and raping and pillaging, and the constant religious idolatry and all that that's tied up with. And we're going to talk about a very important historical detail when we get right to the end that's very much along those lines, especially in the Amorite or Babylonian context. This is the kind of hardness of heart that was in reference and in view on the part of Moses at the end of chapter 2 from last week. And this is the immediate conclusion. There isn't even the extension. There's no possibility for an extension of peace because Og immediately comes forth and attacks the Israelites. Now, in fairness to him, and this is me playing devil's advocate to a degree, he's just seen what the Israelites did to Sihon to the south. Okay? He's just seen the Israelite conquest of Heshbon, which I can guarantee you no one saw coming. Outmanned, out-armoured. You can't really say outgunned, a bit before gunpowder and warfare of the small arms, but nonetheless out-resourced, facing a larger army of decisively more talented warriors. And yet here is the Israelites who have gained the victory. Here now Og stands on this same precipice, seeing the conquest of his Amorite kin, his neighbours to the south. He strikes forth in attack. It's interesting how this parallels, for example, if we're thinking about this in a new covenantal context, to the parable that Christ himself gives, to paraphrase, of taking the seed, that is the seed of the gospel of the kingdom, to use Christ's words, that is thrown upon three different types of surfaces. Do you recall? There is the rocky outcropping, where the seed just doesn't grow because it's hard and it's rocky, there's no receptiveness. There is a field with soil, but it's shallow and it's not nutrient dense at all. In fact, it's nutrient lacking. So things grow for a little while, but then they get whisked away by everything from the wind to the rain to the snow to critters and everything else in between. And then the third type of field that Christ describes there is, of course, the deep, nutrient-rich soil that is ready and prepared for the seed to be planted and for it to flourish into its full array. Okay? This is Christ himself describing anthropology. He's describing the human condition. All of us at one point start exactly and very much like that rocky outcropping, right? The concrete pavement, we might say today. It is only by the Spirit of God and by his grace that moves us into a different state, that indeed by his grace imparted to us by the Holy Spirit are we transformed in our nature. Is our heart of stone, hence the imagery of a rocky outcropping, changed and transformed, regenerated into a heart of flesh. There are many points that Christ draws out in that parable, but one of the most obvious is the fact that you should not waste time, and in fact he expressly says to not waste time, throwing seed on concrete, on a rocky outcropping. nothing will grow. It doesn't matter how much you want it to. It is irrelevant how much emotional intensity you have for thinking that if I just keep trying, then something may happen. This is not meant to dissuade nor discourage you from evangelizing. What it's meant to do, as Christ said on more than one occasion, to use another parallel of not casting pearls before swine. Okay, not giving that which is precious to those who not only will have no use for it, who don't even know what to do with pearls, but rather will roll around in the mud and get you dirty in the process. Not giving that which is valuable to the dogs, who will only turn and attack you. Okay? This is the vitriolic rebel, enemy of God, who, even though you are imparting to them words of gentleness, of grace, of mercy, of love, of everything virtuous, will respond with nothing but pride, arrogance, hubris, anger, envy, bitterness, and vitriol. Do not cast your pearls before swine. Do not throw seed on concrete. Instead, move on to those who are clearly more receptive to the seed of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. Because that's who God has already been working on. He's been preparing the soil. This is why the Apostle Paul says that I may plant, that others may water, but indeed God brings the increase. Yes? But even in that analogy of Paul as an apostle planting, that is predicated, because Paul's not stupid, he knows what Christ said, that is predicated on God already having prepared the soil into which he plants anyway. Do you understand? That's why you always have to read Scripture in light of what? Scripture. You let Scripture interpret Scripture. You join these various threads of themes. How does this relate to what we're seeing here? With the, by implication, hardness of Og's heart, the fact that there is no opportunity for a peace discussion, for negotiation. Instead, there is just immediate violence and rebellion. Well, indeed, this is concrete. This is a rocky outcropping on which nothing will grow, because this is not the time of forgiveness. This is the time of justice. What you see here with the Amorites, especially the Amorites, this is not the first time, we explained this last week, this is not the first time in all of the Bible thus far, up through these first 5 books of the Pentateuch, that we've seen the Amorites. Okay, Abraham himself, centuries prior, interacted with Amorite peoples. Their iniquity was great then. Their iniquity was even greater by now, by this point, by this juncture. This was not something new. They had not temporarily lapsed into some unfavorable behaviors. This was a culture of absolute rampant darkness, chaos, and evil that had been enduring and plaguing the earth for centuries and centuries and centuries on end. God is infinite in his mercy. He is infinite in his grace. Yet he is within full right and liberty to choose when that grace and when that mercy is administered, when it is given. Because indeed we see, not only throughout the scriptures, but indeed that which is promised and foretold beyond them, that there is a day in which God has appointed that the earth shall be judged. And he has appointed the judge as one man, the man whom he raised from the dead, this Jesus Christ. This is what the Apostle Paul says in Athens at the Areopagus to the greatest minds of his day. The testimony of the validity of this is that he raised this judge from the dead, and that he now reigns in universal dominion, and that he, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, presides enthroned as King and Judge. This is a fate that every man will face, and indeed one will be found righteous or unrighteous. One will be found to be a sheep or a goat. He will separate good from evil. He will separate order from chaos. He will make distinction, and he will distinguish between the righteous and the unrighteous. Here, you are seeing the execution of justice which God has so patiently held off for centuries and centuries on end. And you are witnessing the divine wrath of God come down upon people more evil than you are perhaps able to comprehend. This is not the day of mercy. It is not a day of grace. It is a day of justice and a day of judgment. And so hence Moses recounts in verse 3, so Yahweh our God gave Og, king of Bashan, with all his people over into our hand. And we struck them until there was no survivor remaining for him. One thing I want you to notice as you go through this text and as we read is again following the pronouns. It's usually helpful in a given text to follow the pronouns for a variety of reasons, half the time to figure out who's talking, but apart from that, to figure out who is in view. See, all of the references you're going to get here in these first 11 verses, even when talking about men, women, children, the people, the cattle, the land, all these various aspects, they're all referential, not in and of themselves, but rather referential to Og, okay? With all his people. We struck them until there was no survivor remaining of him. Do you understand? Og is the figure, singular, who is ultimately in view here. Everything else is merely in reference to him, and that's going to become very apparent to you by the time we work our way through all the way to verse 11, where Moses ties it all off together, and you will see the big picture of why he is recounting it in this particular fashion. It is, of course, because he is king, and therefore there is this reference to him as king and as therefore the ruler, the one who reigns over this land. But the reasons run deeper. So in verse 4, and we captured all his cities at that time. There was not a town which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob and the kingdom of Og in Bashan. Now this area of Bashan was, we think, a city at that given point, but it was also a reference to the broader area. This is as far north on the eastern side of the Jordan as you can get. It's actually up in the sea, adjacent to the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so we've marched our way all the way up from Ezion-Geber, down at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way up through the various lands that we've seen, the land of Edom, the land of Moab, the land of Ammon, then of course the land of Heshbon, and then now up all the way as far north on the eastern side as this story gets, up in and around the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, as far north as Christ himself ventured during his life and ministry. And there was not a town which they did not take, these Israelites. Whilst not being a large realm, a large kingdom, it was, as far as we can tell archaeologically, quite dense and quite highly developed. The Amorites, again, as I've explained before, were a renowned and powerful people in the ancient Near East at this time period, okay, of the late Bronze Age, as it's known. And having these many cities is within the bounds of what we know people were doing in those times. It's very dense, but it explains again the development of culture. And what here Moses is doing is he's trying to describe to the audience the total annihilation, the total conquest of Og's kingdom. He's trying to implant within you an understanding of how totalizing the victory of Yahweh was. Okay? Just as you see this kind of language appear in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, when Moses again himself is dealing with the Pharaoh, there's this kind of plenary language that ends up being utilized. The Nile River turns to blood. Well, the Nile River is, quite frankly, the longest river in the world. It's an extremely long river, thousands upon thousands of kilometers long. So there's this plenary language. The scope of the literal scope of how much of the Nile was turned to blood is not what's in view. The point is, there is this totalizing element in which Yahweh's domination and dominion over the false gods of Egypt who are being attacked and who are being fought against by Yahweh is what is in view. It's showing the total victory of Yahweh over, in that case, the Egyptian gods. Here is again this similar motif. The total victory of Yahweh over the kingdom of Og. In verse 5, all these cities were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides a great many unwalled towns. Unwalled towns literally means rural towns in Hebrew, right? Villages that were not armed and manned and walled in that sense. But there were many a fortified city. Okay, following from this time, of course, that one of the most significant portions of what comes immediately after this literally is in the opening chapters of the book of Joshua and in the conquest of the most famous ancient walled city, that of Jericho, okay, with its 3-tiered walls that were considered by everyone in the ancient Near Eastern world to be impregnable, to be unconquerable. And so here again, Moses is describing the great fortification, the great resources of Og and of his kingdom, of how they were well defended, of how indeed the Israelites themselves, and this is one of the biggest points to be made here on the part of Moses, the Israelites, in and of themselves, in isolation by their own mortal power or capability, were simply incapable of conquering this kind of kingdom apart from Yahweh. What he is doing here, and I hope you can see it, he's really upselling the kingdom of Og. In an accurate form, obviously, but he's really laying it on thick. He's paying all this attention to how fortified, how armed, how well-developed, well-resourced, well-manned the kingdom of Og was, so that you can see not the greatness of the Israelites, but the greatness of the God of the Israelites. Do you understand? That's what's going on here. It's genius rhetoric on the part of Moses. It's extremely clever, because he's lifting the enemies of Yahweh high upon a great pedestal, showing how great and mighty they were, simply so that he can dunk on them for how much Yahweh conquered them, and how replete, plenary, and total the conquest of the Amorite kingdoms was by Yahweh. And that is not just merely God against man, because you have to, again, I've said to you that verse 11 is one of the most important verses in this entire passage. This ties in with what we will look at by the time we have worked our way through to the very end. And so he continues forth in verse 6, and we devoted them to destruction. Again, we explained this last week, this term. This is a known militaristic term in regards to the ancient Near East. Right? And he repeats it again, well, twice really. And we devoted them to destruction, as we did Sihon, king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction the men, the women, and the little ones of every city. That's the exact same verbiage and wording that we find back in the end of chapter 2, hence the reference to Sihon as king of Heshbon. Devotion to destruction, sometimes also translated as putting them under the ban, was a very familiar, known term that everyone reading this in ancient times would have immediately understood. Okay, it was a designation, and I explained it in full last week, so if you want to get a bit fuller of an understanding, go back and watch last week's sermon. But nonetheless, in the shortened version, you would devote to destruction. You would tell the people standing before you that we are entering, we are going to conquer. Anyone who wishes to flee now, flee now. Do you understand? Anyone who remains is a hostile enemy combatant, by definition. Anyone who remains, you are in danger of conquest. You can flee now. We will give you a window of opportunity, and then that window will close, and you will face the consequences of having chosen to remain. Do you understand? Okay, this is part of the whole peace concept we saw last week. They didn't just roll in, no warning, and just absolutely annihilate everyone. Now again, part of that was, if you want to flee, flee. Okay, this is something that comes up later in the book of Joshua. This is why you end up finding, for example, Goliath in a land of Philistia, particularly and specifically in Gath, because again, the giant clans, at least a tiny remnant of them, clearly fled from the other Canaanite cities where they were from. Okay, the giant clans were not from Philistia. Those are a different people. Again, I explained that last week. Those are a different people that migrate across the eastern Mediterranean, we think from probably Crete, and land there in and around the 12th century, which is a couple hundred years after this point. Okay? Different people. Goliath and his clan clearly had migrated there as Joshua and his army are successively conquering Canaan and pushing the people out. Okay? Similar concept here. We explained that in reference to a common medieval tactic. Again, if you want to flee, flee now. We did the same thing, particularly at the end of World War II with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The people of those cities were warned beforehand that this was going to happen. This wasn't a surprise attack in some literal sense. The people of those cities were warned, and some did flee. One ironically fled Hiroshima to Nagasaki and then unfortunately perished in Nagasaki. But nonetheless, you had the opportunity to flee, and it's the exact same tactic. Perfectly reasonable. Same thing here. Devotion to destruction. And indeed then, those who would remain would be conquered. And unfortunately, and we explained this last week also, those who in our modern day as Christians find themselves trying to engage in all manner of Olympic level mental gymnastics, feeling too compassionate to somehow acknowledge the fact that indeed men, women and children were killed in this conquest. What they do is they fail to realise, unfortunately, A, the nature of the ancient Near Eastern world, how brutally evil it was, how dark it was, how chaotic it was, the fact that no Amorite should dare complain about the death of their children when you've been slaughtering them for centuries. You don't get to turn around and pretend that now Amorite children matter, when you've been sacrificing them as young as 1 week old, that we know, for centuries. The part of this also is that, again, killing of the children who are there because of their parents, who are already being indoctrinated and already being brought into and raised in the customs and cultures of their people, if they were to remain, would simply be what? Pagan. And would more so do what? Seek vengeance. In fact, God literally says this, right? Particularly to Joshua and others. Do not leave any remaining. And this is why at times as you work your way through, the Israelites find themselves in trouble, find themselves commingling with paganism and idolatry, because at certain junctures they did not do what God commanded them to do. They did not drive out those who inhabited the land. Instead, they commingled with them. They intermarried with them, vis-a-vis Samson, and we know how that turned out. This is wisdom coming from God in and amongst the execution of his justice. He devotes them to destruction. But in verse 7, all the animals and the spoils of the city, right, so the resources, the wealth, we took as our plunder. Again, no one in the ancient world would have seen this as even remotely problematic. This is the embodiment of the age-old phrase, to the victor go the spoils. Okay? This is a consequence of losing war. The notion that this was done, by the way, expressly for this purpose, is not what's clearly being communicated. Notice how far down the passage, especially if you take into account the end of chapter 2, how far we've gotten down till now this one sentence reference to them taking the plunder. This is clearly not a war or a battle of conquest for the sake of resources. This is not the Israelites conquering the Amorites just to take their stuff. That is simply the byproduct of victory. That has always been the byproduct of victory in war. And again, if one's modern Western sensibilities are offended, that is usually, and by usually I mean almost always, the byproduct of living in what is categorically the most peaceful time in human history. On the tail end of 2 world wars that killed well over 100 million people that we now benefit from. Where we have not had to have constant threat of invasion from neighbours. The fact that no foreign army has ever, in warfare against us, stepped foot upon this continent in any meaningful sense. If you went back all but a few hundred years ago, no one would believe you. that a land this large, a land that would be about the 8th or the 9th largest empire in human history, just by landmass, had never been invaded before, not without trying for the Japanese, but had never successfully been invaded before, they wouldn't believe you. Because as is said in, I believe, chapter 9 or chapter 10 of the book of Job, the very first verse, the life of man on earth is war. And this is true not just in the physical sense, but also in the spiritual, of course. And so in verse 8, as Moses continues, thus we took the land at that time from the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. Okay, this is him describing the same kind of territories that we explained last week. The conquest of the 2 Amorite kings and their kingdoms, consequently, beyond the Jordan. In this case, you're used to seeing that word beyond the Jordan, usually written by people who are actually now west of the Jordan. Here, they're still east of the Jordan. In this context, perhaps a more direct literal translation would actually be on this side of the Jordan. But either way, you're used to seeing beyond the Jordan because most times, as you work through from Joshua onward, they are on that side. So describing the eastern side is beyond the Jordan. But the point here is this is basically the rounding up here on Moses' part. This is the conclusionary statement. So whereas Moses ties the recounting of the story together. Thus we took the land at that time from the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were in this land on this side of the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon, again fulfilling the very promises made of the land that would be given to the descendants of Abraham. And here Moses is triumphantly testifying to the fulfillment on God's part of the promises that he made to his people. And then what we have is a transition in verses 9, 10, and 11. And what we find therein specifically is something quite fascinating. Again, this is part what we have referred to before, editorial explanation. There is part of this going on here, especially when you see some of the way that the wording is used, but it really emphasizes the broad meta-narrative point of what is going on here. So this is perhaps, on a theological level, one of the more significant areas or portions of this that really ties this all in, especially for us here, thousands of years later. Okay, I will do my best to bridge this knowledge gap, as I usually try to do, and so hopefully we can leave with seeing the theological arc of this entire portion of the end of chapter 2, and then particularly here the beginning of chapter 3. So verse 9, 10 and 11. Again, a number of your translations should have parentheses, right? So brackets. Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, and the Amorites call it Senir. Again, we've seen this in chapter 2, where it's an explanation of what these name places are called at the given time in which this is being written, so the audience actually understands where on earth they're being talked about. Okay? Again, it, like I'm doing now, is bridging a knowledge gap. Verse 10, all the cities of the plateau, and all Gilead, and all Bashan as far as Selachah and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan, again for that same purpose of description, of understanding of where this is. Verse 11, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Now, we've explained before, mainly because the text itself in chapter 2 explains it earlier on in the chapter, that there were one of these other main editorial explanations was explaining the different names for this group of the Rephaim, right? Known to this group as the Rephaim, which is primarily the Hebrew word. Known to this group as the Amorites. Known to this group as Anakim, right? Descendants of Anak, this ancient figure which we have testified to us not only in scripture but also in Egyptian sources as well, right? Explaining the various names. We've explained before that these are the names given amongst different languages, be it Egyptian, Hebrew, Ugaritic, Aramaic, etc., for these group of giant clans. Again, the notion of giants, and I'll explain what that means as we get through verse 11, is not isolated or unique to the scriptures. In fact, it's the very opposite. We have an almost universal, cross-cultural record and testimony of giants, of extremely large people dwelling in lands all over the world. You find this in Egyptian writings, you find this in Ugaritic, you find this in Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, Elamite, Persian, you find this in Arabia, you find this in Greece, Rome, you find this in the Germanic peoples, right? So Germany, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, etc. You find this in the British Isles, you find this in Asia, all across Asia, East Asia, North Asia, South Asia, everywhere. You find this in North America. You find this quite surprisingly often in North America, actually, in very odd descriptions, right, of giant people of white skin with red hair, which doesn't exactly fit the typical anthropomorphic description of native North Americans. You find this all over. You find this in Mesoamerica, South America, etc. Okay? Much like the flood. Right? My primary, or one of, at least I'd say, one of the primary reasons why I am convinced of a historic flood in ancient times is not just merely because God says it, although that's reason enough. It's because everyone says it. Okay, because everyone says it. Because again, cross-culturally, you find this account, again, differences of details here and there, right, that fit in with how kind of stories, especially oral traditions, develop over the course of centuries, if not thousands of years. But the same fundamental story is present, again, cross-culturally, thousands of cultures across thousands of years. All right? So my broadest reason for believing it is the fact that everyone says so. Right? Same concept here with giant clans, right, or with giant tribes. The scriptures say it, but even in the broader sense, why do I believe it? Because everyone says so. Right, my conclusion is either all these people who never met each other were lying, which is a very modern take for the modern Westerner, or they were telling the truth. Do you understand? Right? It's not something that's unique at all to the Bible in literally any capacity. Okay, this is just one of a very long list and wide list of cross-cultural, cross-temporal traditions, stories, customs of giant clans. The Egyptians say, point blank, that there were giant clans in the land of Canaan. Point blank. Not the Israelites, the Egyptians. So the Israelites and their greatest ancient enemy both say the same thing. I think that's probably pretty decent evidence. Yeah? What you see here is a description that is going along this kind of form or this kind of line, and says there that Og of Bashan was the remaining of the Rephaim. Now one might think or posit in their head, the first question that often comes to people is, but what about Goliath? Okay, what about Goliath? Now, whilst there is a very interesting point to be drawn about the etymology of the words used to describe his height, which is not for today, because that would require far too long of an explanation to take you through literally the history of manuscripts and how we understand what those heights mean. The point being is that what is far more in view here, especially because Og is being so centrally focused upon throughout this entire portion, right? The peoples are his army, his cities, his cattle. It's all in reference to Og. Og is the one who is central focus, and anyone else who's mentioned here is in reference back to Og. Okay, Og being described as the last, or as the last remaining, your translation might say the remnant of the Rephaim. To put this simply, in bringing this out of the Hebrew, it carries with it the connotation of his authority, particularly as a king, and more about his esteem and his position as a man of renown, as an ancient great man, right? Not great in the moral sense, great in terms of stature. Not just literally, but also in terms of authority as a king, right? Goliath was none of these things. Goliath was the champion of Gath and of the Philistine army more broadly, right? The champion being the designated warrior, the greatest warrior among them. But he's not a king in any meaningful sense, okay? He's not a ruler of that kind. It's elevating again the position of Og. He is the last of the Rephaim. And what could also be in view here, perhaps as well, bringing it out of the Hebrew, is that he is falling under this description of Rephaim, and that Goliath later on, by the time you get through the Bible into books of Samuel and elsewhere, that Goliath himself is not considered part of the Rephaim, but is considered more broadly as Anakim, descendants of Anak. Okay, there's a whole bunch of things that would take much more longer to explain. Right? I just wanted to simply explain at least that portion so that there wasn't confusion as to why is he being described as the last of the Rephaim, but then you have this figure Goliath later on. Okay, if we did an entire sermon on it, I'd be able to open it all up in much fuller detail, but that's just, I wanted to point that out there. There's no contradiction. It's just a matter of how terms are being used in Hebrew, especially across different time periods. Okay, but the main point is not that, because this is the main point, especially of verse 11. Only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. It is in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. It is, present tense. Okay? Its length was 9 cubits, and its width 4 cubits by ordinary cubit. There's very important things to unpack here, which bring into fruition the driving point of the overarching narrative arc of this morning's passage, and that is this. Bedstead, perfectly acceptable translation, eres, with in Hebrew, not to be confused with eretz, which is the word for earth, not the planet Earth, but it's in earth as in land as opposed to the sea. Eres, E-R-E-S, if you want to think of it in English, describes a bed, and that's a perfectly accurate translation, but it's important to understand what the context of that word is. Because etymologically, not just in Hebrew, but in other languages as well, particularly in Amorite and in other such related languages, it has attached to it as part of what we call its semantic domain, so the possible meanings and how that connects, that of a sarcophagus or a tomb. Okay? That of a sarcophagus or a tomb, a burial. Okay? The ancient world, and you will be familiar with this from the scriptures because it happens here all the time, people in the ancient world often euphemized death or conceived of it as like going to sleep. Okay, you find that not just Old Testament but New Testament, right? I'm seeing some head nods, which is good. Okay, of like going to sleep. Sometimes, especially in the last 200 years, that's kind of been thought of in the West as, maybe they believed in this thing called like soul sleep. No, that's not at all what's going on there. No, they very much knew what happened with death, and they all had concepts of realms beyond death, of the afterlife, as you might say, but they euphemized and conceived of death as like going to sleep. Okay, you would lay the corpse flat, like they were sleeping on a bed. Okay, and that's an important connection here of what's going on. Right? We have found these kinds of tombs and sarcophagi all over the ancient Near East, all over the exact territories that are being described here, not in the east of the Jordan, but also west of the Jordan, all throughout. Okay, fascinatingly, by the way, this place that you have mentioned, if you look at in verse 11, it is in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. So in other words, it's in Rabbah, the city of Rabbah, in the territory of Ammon. And whenever this particular wording is being written, it's present tense, it is. So in other words, it's in Rabbah to this day. So the original audience of this could have gone and seen it, right? They could go there and they could actually see it and visit it, right? We have found archaeologically in Rabbah, which today is the city of Amman, which is the capital of the kingdom of Jordan, more than one, but one specific that is actually exactly this length. Okay, many of you will not be familiar with cubits in terms of any specific sense. There were a variety of different lengths of cubits that ranged from about 45 to 55 inches. Okay, a cubit in a technical sense was the length of forearm from the finger to elbow. Okay, it's how human beings measured things, right? Differences of length, but even if you took the Babylonian cubit, it works out to be, at least if you're going 9 by 4, it works out to be about 13.5 feet, roughly, by 6 feet wide. Okay. Here's what needs to happen, and this is an extremely important point. This is the pin. It is an assumption to assume that the length of the bed, i.e. sarcophagus, tomb described, is designed to be commensurate to the length of the individual, in this case, Og. Okay? I'm going to explain to you why. The inclusion of this detail is one of those kind of details that to most of us today can kind of go over the head, but I can promise you that ancient Israelites immediate light bulb moment. Immediately would have gone, okay, yeah. And we're all sitting here going, what? Right? They immediately would have recognized these two numbers, and here's why. In Babylon, keeping in mind the Amorites are a Babylonian people. This is all their culture. These are just the Western Amorites here in this land. In Babylon specifically, there was a very famous portion of the religious cycle and the religious calendar. And the first beginning of the first new moon of the spring equinox, the new year, they would have a 12-day festival, okay, celebrating all manner of things from the cycle of rebirth and planting of the new seeds for crops and etc., etc. One of the most important religious festivals at this time period in ancient Bronze Age Babylon, held at Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, right, which is a ziggurat, for those who are unaware, is a pyramidal structure. Right, it's a great temple that's the type of temple the Babylonians built. It looks like a pyramid. You're probably more familiar with the Egyptian variety. This was like that in terms of its four-sided triangular structure building up. Right, we've explained before the fact that the ancient pagans valued mountains because that's where the gods resided. Okay, and the great temple, the great ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, was dedicated to the god of Babylon, the chief god, right, the patron god of Babylon, Marduk, okay, which you've been familiar with, hopefully, in other areas of Scripture. He is the national god of the Babylonians. At the climax of this great festival, he and his consort, Sanapit, would go into the great temple, the great ziggurat, into what was called the sacred marriage chamber, sometimes known as the divine union chamber. Therein would be a bed, because again, this is all about the cycle of rebirth and of blessing, and all manner of cultic sex rituals were tied up with this 12-day festival, and it would reach its climax, its zenith, with worship going on, with Marduk entering into the sacred marriage chamber and then consummating, and then this was the great climax. We think that maybe historically this was actually embodied by the king of Babylon and a selected virgin priestess. I'm not sure about that, but we think that may have happened. You're seeing all of this very occultic pagan worship going, okay? Does anyone want to guess how big the sacred marriage bed at the ziggurat of Babylon was? It's staring you right in the face in your text. It was, as the text says, 9 cubits long by 4 cubits wide. Exactly. Okay? This is like you seeing the number 666. Immediately, you would reference it as what? How that number gets used, not just the base number 6, but also especially the number 666 throughout the scriptures, okay? That comes up all the time in connection with man, therefore the connection with sin and everything else. Just as a brief side point, it's 666. It's not 666, but 666, and that's an important part of it. But you would immediately have an association with that number, yes? Okay? Israelites immediately would have seen 9 cubits by 4 cubits. Immediately they would have known exactly what that was talking about. That's talking about the sacred marriage chamber at the great ziggurat in Babylon. Because who is the national god of the Amorites? Marduk. Okay. So what am I saying by this? Am I saying that all this was fake and this is just some nice symbology? No. Actually, I'm saying the opposite. This was absolutely a real tomb, right? A real heiress, a bed, right? Just like the sacred marriage bed in Babylon. That indeed those who buried Og would have done so to connect him to Marduk, especially by the fact that he was king in Bashan. You could go and see it, and we have found, literally in Rabbah, which today is modern day the city of Amman in Jordan, we have found archaeologically those tombs matching these exact dimensions. Okay? This really happened, and we have the archaeological evidence to prove it. The point is, though, and this is how it's tying all together, Marduk, as the national god of Babylonian and Amorite peoples generally, including Og, who would have been considered to have had a special relationship with Marduk, he is now dead. he's dead. And he's been buried in connection with this sacred marriage bed from the great ziggurat in Babylon. This is exactly the same theme, exactly the same concept, going all the way back to the 10 plagues of Egypt, as we've explained before. All 10 of those plagues were very specific, direct, blindingly obvious to everyone in that day attack on the pantheon, the gods of Egypt, especially and particularly the last one, the 10th plague, which was what? The slaying of the firstborn sons of Egypt in retribution for what? Not the random arbitrary capriciousness of God, but rather the previous Pharaoh's slaying of the firstborn sons of the Israelites. And who gets killed in the process of that, other than all the firstborn sons of Egypt? The firstborn son of the Pharaoh. We've explained before, and I'll explain here again because this is how it ties in. The pharaohs of Egypt, even in that time period, and all the way through that time period, were the very embodiment, personification of the Egyptian god Horus. He literally lived in, through, and by them. They were fundamentally Horus incarnate. That is exactly what the concept was. And as soon as the pharaoh would die, the king, and his then son would immediately become King Horus, would move from that to this. He would go from this pharaoh to that pharaoh, and you would have Horus continually inhabiting the pharaoh, who was a god in the flesh. Do you understand? The killing of the firstborn sons, including the son of Pharaoh, was God severing, in the mind of the Egyptians, the line of succession, not just of the pharaohs, but of Horus. It was not just even figuratively, it was literally a death blow to one of the most important Egyptian gods, the god who embodied the king of all the world as far as the Egyptians were concerned. It was a severing of that. Total victory. Here, we are being given an explicit reference attaching Og to Marduk by virtue of his tomb being built to the exact same dimensions as the sacred marriage bed from the great ziggurat in Babylon. And now that king is also dead. This is the absolute and final, pardon the pun, nail in the coffin of Yahweh's victory over yet another false god. That is the point. Do you understand? Because these passages are all about testifying to not how great the Israelites were, because newsflash, they weren't, but rather how almighty, how victorious, how triumphant is Yahweh, our God. He is King of kings, he is Lord of lords, he is God over all gods. He resides and dwells in session and precedence among what elsewhere in the Old Testament would be described as the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, the divine council, and he rules, not Marduk. He rules, not Horus. There is but one God. There is but one eternal creator. There is but one who is in divine and cosmic imperium. And that is Yahweh. And that is indeed Yahweh in the flesh, the second person, Christ himself, who now himself is enthroned at the right hand of the Father, who reigns in universal dominion. And he is bringing all his enemies beneath his feet. And he will continue to conquer until he has conquered the great and last enemy, that of death itself. The very death which he has been dealing to false gods for thousands of years and counting. We have seen this testified to us throughout the history of Christendom. The death of the Greek gods, the death of the Roman gods, the death of the Germanic gods, gods who are long gone and far forgotten, whose temples lie in ruins, whose worship is non-existent. We face new gods in our day, god of media, gods of politics, gods of money, gods of corporatism, unbridled by anything like conscience, for example. We face new gods. But indeed, just as Yahweh has conquered all of the old gods, so shall he conquer those of the new. He has testified that he is the great God slayer, and he shall continue to slay gods from here till kingdom come. Amen.